I never imagined that something as harmless as a can of paint would be the catalyst for unraveling a web of corruption, greed, and betrayal in my own neighborhood. But here I was, holding a letter from my homeowners association, about to face a challenge that would change my life and the entire neighborhood forever. It wasn't just a fine for a small mistake. It was the beginning of a fight against a powerful, faceless system that had ruled us with an iron fist. The fine wasn't for an offensive color or an outrageous violation. No, it was for 0.5% off the approved beige. That's right, a fraction of a percent. And for that, they wanted $1,000. At first, I thought it was a joke. How could something so trivial lead to such a massive punishment? Beige was beige, right? In the grand scheme of things, was this really a battle worth fighting? But when I read the letter again, more carefully this time, the sting of the fine hit me harder. The letter, wrapped in cold bureaucratic language, claimed that my home violated the HOA's strict aesthetic code, and it even went so far as to threaten further penalties if I didn't comply. I stared at the fine in disbelief, holding the paper as though it might magically turn into something more reasonable. But it didn't. The numbers were real, $1,000 for being 0.5% off the approved shade. I mean, who even measures beige to the 100th%? Was this some kind of twisted joke? A prank? Perhaps someone was testing my patience. But no, this wasn't some absurd reality show. This was the HOA, self-appointed guardians of all things suburban. It was their job to enforce these ridiculous rules right down to the shade of beige that adorned every home. Apparently personal choice or even a slight deviation from their perfect color palette was unacceptable. To them, I was a criminal, a rule breaker who had dared to make a choice in the face of conformity. The letter didn't just stop at the fine. It came with a stern warning. Either I repaint my entire house to match the exact approved shade or face additional fines. Could you imagine repainting a house just because it wasn't 100% in line with their specifications? This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was an insult. It was the HOA flexing its muscle, showing me who was really in charge. For a moment, I considered just paying the fine and moving on. Most people in my position probably would. Who wants to deal with the hassle of fighting the HOA, especially when they can make your life miserable with endless fines and threats? They could keep the 1,000, repaint, and end the nightmare. But something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about a can of paint anymore. It was about something much bigger. If I gave in now, what would stop them from fining me for something else in the future? And what about everyone else in the neighborhood? How many more people had been punished for insignificant offenses, all in the name of an outdated, tyrannical code? I realized that this fine, this ridiculous attempt at controlling my property, was only the tip of the iceberg. What if the HOA was hiding something darker, something that went beyond their obsession with beige and perfectly trimmed lawns? What if they were embezzling funds? What if they were abusing their power in ways that no one had even begun to question? I couldn't let it go. I wasn't going to be another victim. Not this time. I made a promise to myself I wasn't going to repaint my house to meet their ridiculous demands. I was going to fight, and if they wanted to fine me for every inch of deviation, I'd make them regret it. But that wasn't all. I wasn't just going to roll over. I was going to investigate. I would dig deeper into the HOA's finances, their practices, their shady rules. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the first time they'd gone too far. What if the HOA had been using their power to line their own pockets? What if they were taking advantage of their position to siphon off funds meant for community improvement? If this was just the beginning, there had to be more. A secret world behind the HOA's pristine white fences. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about a paint shade, it was about the system itself. And so, my journey began. A journey that started with a simple letter about beige paint, but would eventually lead me to something far bigger, something that would turn my entire neighborhood upside down. They thought they could intimidate me with fines and threats, But they were about to learn something they hadn't counted on. If they thought a 0.5% off Beige was going to break me, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. After receiving that absurd $1,000 fine, I was beyond furious, but I wasn't about to back down. It wasn't just about the paint anymore. It was about power, control, and how the HOA had been running this neighborhood like it was their personal kingdom. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to let their petty rules stand in my way. I started with the basics, the HOA's financial records. Now, I knew this was a long shot. HOA boards rarely give up their financial records unless you're a lawyer or someone with more authority than a disgruntled homeowner. But hey, I wasn't about to let that stop me. I had a hunch that something wasn't quite right, and I was determined to find out what. I began talking to my neighbors, hoping to gather some inside information. There were a few who had been living in the neighborhood for years, and surely they must have some horror stories about the HOA's overreach. One neighbor, Karen, of course, had been fined multiple times for things like having the wrong shade of mailbox red and keeping her garbage bins out for a few extra hours on pickup day. It seemed that no matter how minor the infraction, the HOA always had their hands out for more money. I spoke to another neighbor, Bill, who'd been slapped with a fine for not trimming his hedges exactly according to the HOA's approved height. Bill was livid, of course, and when I asked him if he thought the HOA was overstepping their bounds, he gave me the perfect answer. They've got too much time on their hands, that's for sure. It was obvious I wasn't the only one who felt like the HOA was making mountains out of molehills. The more I talked to people, the more I started to notice a pattern. It wasn't just about my paint color. The HOA seemed to thrive on small fines and petty rules, the kind of things that would drive anyone mad after a while. It wasn't like they were offering real solutions for improving the neighborhood. They were simply using their power to control every little detail of our lives. But what really caught my attention was a conversation I overheard at one of the HOA meetings. These meetings were always held at weird times, usually when normal people were working, so I was one of the few people who actually bothered to show up. I wasn't trying to get into arguments or stir things up. I just wanted to see how the whole operation ran behind the scenes. I figured the more I knew, the better prepared I'd be to take them down. At one meeting, I overheard a conversation between Susan Morrow, the HOA treasurer, and a few of the board members. They were discussing the budget allocation for neighborhood improvements, and that's when I heard something strange. Susan was talking about how the HOA needed to reallocate funds to cover some new community projects. When I asked around, nobody knew exactly what these projects were. All I got was vague, half-formed answers. But I was starting to get suspicious. Here's the thing, Susan had been the treasurer for a while, and she was very secretive about the HOA's finances. It wasn't unusual for her to leave out details when talking about the budget, but the way she kept things locked down made me wonder, was she hiding something? It didn't take long for me to realize that if I was going to uncover what was really going on, I would need to get my hands on some actual documents. And that meant I'd need to be clever. I started doing some research into how I might get access to their financial records. The HOA was a non-profit organization, so they were legally required to maintain transparency when it came to their financial dealings. If I could find a way to force them to release the records, I could prove that something shady was going on. But how? I did what any self-respecting person would do. I started asking questions. I asked neighbors if they'd ever seen a copy of the budget or if they knew where the records were kept. Most people didn't know, but one neighbor, Tom, worked for a law firm that dealt with property issues. He knew exactly how to get access to these kinds of documents. Tom gave me the best advice. If you want the records, you're going to have to ask for them formally. You have a right to know where the money is going, especially when fines are being collected. Armed with this new knowledge, I drafted a formal letter to the HOA requesting access to their financial records. I wasn't asking for a favor, I was demanding it under the law. I made sure the letter was polite but firm, outlining my right as a homeowner to view the records. I wasn't just doing this to be difficult. I was doing it because I had a feeling that this wasn't just about my house's color. No, this was about a long-standing abuse of power. And that's when the real investigation began. It wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about finding the truth. Whatever the HOA was hiding, I was determined to uncover it. It wasn't long before I received a response from the HOA. But unsurprisingly, it wasn't the kind of response I had hoped for. The letter I got back was a stonewall. They claimed that the financial records I requested were private and not for public viewing. They cited some vague clause in the HOA's bylaws that essentially gave them the power to withhold this information. I wasn't having it. At this point, I had already taken the first step towards something bigger. I knew this wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about power, corruption, and the sneaky ways the HOA had been operating. They weren't just being petty with their fines. They were hiding something much more sinister, and I was determined to uncover it, one way or another. I wasn't one to back down easily, so I did what any determined person would do. I got a little creative. I reached out to Tom again, the neighbor who worked for the law firm. He told me something interesting that set the gears in motion. If they're refusing to release their financials, it's a sign they're trying to cover something up. You've got rights under the law. Keep pushing. His words were enough to light a fire under me. Tom suggested that I file a formal complaint with the local government. If the HOA was denying access to financial records, it could be considered a violation of local property laws. HOA boards are supposed to be transparent, especially when it comes to how they manage the community's funds. This was my chance to push them into a corner. Armed with my new plan, I filed a formal complaint. It wasn't a quick process, but within a few weeks, I got word that the local authorities were going to investigate the HOA. This was exactly what I needed, a chance to put pressure on the board, forcing them to open up their books. The fear of an official audit from local authorities was enough to make the HOA sweat. I could already imagine the panic setting in, but as I waited for the investigation to begin, I didn't sit idly by. I knew the HOA wasn't going to roll over that easily. While the authorities took their time, I decided to dig deeper myself. If there was something shady going on, I was going to find it. It was during this time that I made an unexpected discovery. While snooping around the HOA's office, don't judge, I had my reasons, I found an old filing cabinet tucked away in a dusty corner. The cabinet was locked, but nothing a little creativity couldn't solve. After a few minutes of fiddling with the lock, I was in. Inside, I found something that made my heart race, a set of financial documents that went back several years. These were not the records the HOA had been reluctant to release. No, these were something much more revealing. The papers detailed a series of mysterious transactions, all marked as community improvement projects or special funds. But here's the kicker. There was no explanation for what those projects actually were. No details, no invoices, just large sums of money being transferred into accounts under names I didn't recognize. I flipped through the files faster, and that's when I found it. There, buried under layers of spreadsheets and invoices, was a payment to a company owned by none other than Susan Morrow's husband. Susan, as you'll recall, was the HOA treasurer, the one who had been so secretive about the finances. Her husband's company had been receiving hefty payments for services rendered, but no one knew what those services actually entailed. It was the smoking gun I had been waiting for. This wasn't just about overblown fines for off-beige paint. This was embezzlement. The HOA had been funneling money into Susan's husband's business for years. They had been using the funds that should have been used to maintain our neighborhood for personal gain. It was all right here, in black and white. I felt a mixture of triumph and disgust. This was exactly what I had suspected, but seeing it in writing made it all the more real. The HOA wasn't just a group of petty rule enforcers. They were criminals, using their position to steal from homeowners like me. And I had the proof. But as satisfying as this discovery was, it was only the beginning. Now I had to figure out what to do with this information. I couldn't just sit on it. This wasn't something that could be ignored. I needed to expose them, not just for my own sake, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been taken advantage of. I took a deep breath and made a decision. The only way to truly take down the HOA was to go public with what I had found. It was time to let the neighborhood and the world know what was really going on. Now that I had the evidence, I knew I couldn't just sit on it. I had to act, and I had to act fast. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about getting revenge for a ridiculous $1,000 fine. This was about stopping a corrupt system that had been stealing from homeowners for years. It wasn't just my house they were manipulating. They had their claws in everyone's pocketbooks, and it was time to expose them. But I wasn't about to go in all guns blazing. I needed to be strategic. If I just marched into the next HOA meeting waving these financial documents around, they'd surely find a way to discredit me, dismiss me, or worst case, accuse me of fabricating evidence. No, this had to be handled carefully, with precision. I needed a plan. I decided the best course of action was to gather support from my neighbors. I wasn't the only one who had been fined or felt oppressed by the HOA. Plenty of people had suffered under their petty rules, their draconian measures. For things as trivial as the height of grass or the approved mailbox style. If I could get enough people on my side, it would be harder for the HOA to sweep this under the rug. So, I started by reaching out to those who had the most complaints about the HOA. I spoke to Bill, who had been fined for not trimming his hedge to the exact height, something that, as he put it, looked fine to me, but apparently not fine enough for the HOA. Then there was Karen, the woman who had been penalized for putting up a flag in her front yard that was a little too high. They all had their own grievances, and they all hated the HOA with a passion. But most importantly, they all wanted change. Wasn't asking them to go all in on a crusade, but I needed them to understand the scope of what was really going on. We weren't just fighting over paint colors or lawn care. We were fighting a system of corruption that had been stealing money from every homeowner in the neighborhood. I shared the financial documents I had found, Susan Morrow's shady transactions, the large sums funneled into her husband's company, and they were shocked. Some were angry, others were disbelieving at first, but when they saw the numbers and the connections, they all agreed something had to be done. The next step was clear. I had to go public. The more people knew about the corruption, the harder it would be for the HOA to brush it off. I decided to reach out to the local news. The media was my way in. They would bring the kind of scrutiny that would force the HOA to act, to address the situation publicly. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged by this rogue HOA. I knew the story would be compelling. Who wouldn't want to hear about a small-town HOA that had been embezzling funds for years? This wasn't just about petty fines anymore. This was about real money. Money that should have been used for community improvements, not lining the pockets of a select few. I contacted a local reporter, someone I had heard had an interest in property law and community governance issues. Her name was Lisa, and after a brief conversation, she agreed to meet and hear me out. I gave her the rundown of everything I had discovered, from the fines to the embezzlement. She was skeptical at first, but when I showed her the documents, she stopped dead in her tracks. "This is huge," she said. And I could tell she wasn't just humoring me, she was as stunned as I was. Lisa agreed to help me investigate further. She began reaching out to other residents to get their stories, to build a case that wasn't just based on my word, but on the collective experience of the community. The more she dug, the more people came forward with their own horror stories about the HOA's overreach, the fines, and the ridiculousness of their demands. People were mad. They wanted to see the HOA held accountable. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any better, the authorities began to get involved. My formal complaint had been forwarded to the local government, and it was being taken seriously. A local prosecutor's office had opened an investigation into the HOA's financial dealings. There was a real chance that this was going to blow. wide open. Everything was lining up. I had the evidence, I had the support of my neighbors. The media was on my side, and the local authorities were now looking at the HOA with a fine-tooth comb. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like I wasn't fighting alone. The HOA was about to get a taste of its own medicine. The plan was unfolding, and I could feel the walls closing in on them. They had underestimated me, and now they were about to pay the price. The wait was excruciating. As the investigation into the HOA's shady practices continued, things started to pick up speed. Neighbors who had once been too fearful to speak out began to rally behind me, their voices growing louder with every new revelation. Lisa, the reporter, had been working tirelessly, digging up dirt on the HOA and connecting the dots between Susan Morrow, her husband's company, and the millions of dollars that had mysteriously disappeared. And with the authorities now officially involved, I could feel the walls closing in on the HOA. The media frenzy kicked into high gear. Stories about the HOA's corruption started making headlines in local papers. What had started as a single complaint about an unjust paint fine had transformed into a full-scale exposé. Everyone in the neighborhood was talking about it, and people who had kept their heads down for years were now stepping forward with their own complaints. It was clear that the HOA's reign of petty terror was coming to an end. The best part? The authorities were starting to take the matter seriously. The prosecutor's office had launched a criminal investigation, and they were zeroing in on the financial mismanagement that had been going on for years. As soon as that news hit, the HOA board members were sweating bullets. Susan Morrow, the treasurer, who had always carried herself with a sense of superiority, was now facing questions about her involvement in the embezzlement scheme. The once dominant board was unraveling, and their power was slipping through their fingers. One evening, I got a call from Tom, my lawyer friend, who had been helping me navigate this mess. "It's happening," he said, his voice full of anticipation. "The authorities have subpoenaed the HOA's records, and they've found the same discrepancies you uncovered. This is going to blow up." I could hardly believe it. It felt surreal. My initial suspicion about the HOA's corruption had morphed into something much bigger than I'd ever imagined. The once infallible HOA that had bullied residents with fines, ruled with an iron fist, and lived in their ivory tower was crumbling. And I was the one who had brought them down. But as much as I wanted to bask in the sweet taste of victory, I knew there was still work to be done. The board members had been caught red-handed, but they hadn't been arrested yet. The investigation was far from over. The media coverage, the public outrage, and the growing support from my neighbors all pointed to one thing: the HOA was going to fall. It was only a matter of time before their reign of terror was over, and then the news broke. Lisa called me, her voice brimming with excitement. "It's official," she said. "The HOA board members have been charged with embezzlement and fraud. They're facing criminal prosecution, and Susan Morrow has been arrested. The entire HOA is being dissolved." I was in shock. I had imagined this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. The people who had made my life a nightmare for the past few years, who had fined me for the most ridiculous things, were finally getting what they deserved. They were being held accountable for the money they had stolen. From the community, the HOA, which had once felt like an invincible institution, was no more. But the fallout didn't end there. The dissolution of the HOA left a vacuum of power. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to stand up now felt emboldened. The streets that had once been filled with tension and fear were suddenly buzzing with excitement. The residents of the neighborhood were ready to take back control. We had a chance to rebuild the community, to create something that wasn't ruled by petty tyrants. But as happy as I was, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of disbelief. After all, it all started with a $1,000 fine over a paint color. Who would have thought that something as trivial as a shade of beige could lead to the downfall of an entire HOA? It was both comical and bittersweet. What began as a simple disagreement had turned into a full-blown investigation, a criminal case, and the end of a corrupt system. Still, as I watched the news reports flood in and the board members' faces plastered across the television, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone who had suffered under the HOA's reign. The neighborhood was finally free. The HOA was finished. And as for me, well, I was about to repaint my house, this time with whatever shade of beige I damn well am pleased. But I wasn't just walking away from this fight with a fresh coat of paint. I was walking away knowing that I had taken down a system of corruption, one small victory at a time. And in the end, that's what mattered most. It had been a few months since the HOA's downfall, and the neighborhood had never felt more alive. The oppressive, ever-watchful eyes of the HOA board were gone, and in their place was a sense of freedom that was almost palpable. It was as though a weight had been lifted off the community's shoulders. People were walking around with smiles, chatting with their neighbors, and even adding personal touches to their homes that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Things that used to warrant a fine, like a flag in the yard or an untrimmed bush, were now part of the neighborhood's charm. For me, it was hard to believe that my battle against the HOA had led to all this. It started with something as trivial as a paint color, a $1,000 fine for a shade of beige that was 0.5% off. But somehow that small inconvenience had sparked a chain of events that unraveled the very institution that had tormented me and so many others for years. And I was the one who had exposed it all. Me, the person who was once the target of their ridiculous fines, was now the one who had brought them down. It felt surreal. But beyond the personal satisfaction of watching the HOA crumble, there was something else that felt even better. Seeing the community come together, there was no longer the silent resentment that had hung in the air like a cloud. No more hushed conversations about how the HOA was overstepping its bounds. People were coming together, organizing block parties, cleaning up the parks, and even starting to discuss how to form a new, more democratic neighborhood association, one that would actually listen to the residents and serve the community, not just line the pockets of corrupt board members. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch when I noticed a familiar face walking down the street. Bill, the neighbor who had been fined for his hedge. He was walking toward me with a big smile on his face, and in his hand he had a bottle of wine. "Thought you could use this," he said, handing it over. I laughed. "Thanks, Bill. You know, I think we all could use a drink after everything that's happened." Bill nodded. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day the HOA would be gone. You've done something most people only dream about, taking down a corrupt system, and because of that, we can finally live without being micromanaged." It was moments like these that made everything worth it. The chaos, the stress, the fear of retaliation, all of it had been worth it. I hadn't just taken down the HOA, I had taken down a system that had made everyday life miserable for so many people. That evening, we sat on the porch, enjoying the warm summer breeze, sipping wine, and reminiscing about the old days when the HOA would drive around looking for someone to fine. We all laughed about it now, but there was a real sense of relief in the air. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like home again. The next week, a few of my neighbors and I decided to meet with a local attorney to discuss forming a new neighborhood association. This time, we were going to do things differently. No more arbitrary fines, no more petty rules. We wanted a system where the residents had a voice, where decisions were made transparently, and where everyone felt like they were part of a community rather than just another victim of an overzealous HOA. The attorney was enthusiastic about our plans. He explained that it was possible to create a new, self-governed neighborhood association that was legally binding and could help address any concerns that might arise in the future, without the need for a draconian set of rules. It was a new chapter for us, a chance to rebuild the community from the ground up. As I left the meeting, I couldn't help but smile. It was hard to believe that it had all started with a simple complaint about a paint color. I had taken on the HOA, exposed their corruption, and come out victorious. But in doing so, I had also brought my neighborhood together. The real victory wasn't just in seeing the HOA fall, it was in seeing my neighbors empowered, working together to create a better future. The following months were full of community events, from barbecues to yard sales and everything in between. People who had never spoken before were now chatting over coffee, planning activities, and even working together to maintain the neighborhood. We'd gone from a divided, fearful community to one that was united and stronger than ever. And as for me, well, I didn't just get my 1,000 fine overturned. I got something much more valuable, a community that was finally free to thrive without the fear of an overbearing HOA. One evening, I walked down my street, looking at the homes of my neighbors, their gardens blooming, flags flying, and front porches full of life. It felt like a dream. And for the first time in years, I could proudly say that I had played a part in making it all happen. So, here I am, standing on the front steps of my home, looking at the house I had once been fined for painting incorrectly, now standing as a symbol of defiance and victory. The HOA was gone, the neighborhood was mine again, and I had done what most people only wish they could do. I had stood up to the system and won. And next time, well, I might just paint my house whatever shade of beige I want, because clearly I can do whatever I please.